Take off your shoe right now. If you can't, think back to the last time you saw your bare feet. Look down at your second toe, the one sitting right next to your big toe. Measure it with your eyes. Does it reach past your big toe? Does it extend beyond it, even by a few millimeters? If it does, stop scrolling, because you're looking at one of the strangest and most misunderstood features on the entire human body, and almost nobody who has it knows why it's there. In 1504, when Michelangelo unveiled his 17-foot marble statue of David in Florence, thousands of people gathered to see what would become one of the most studied works of art in human history. Art historians have spent 5 centuries analyzing David's proportions, his stance, the tension in his hand, the vein in his forearm. Almost nobody talks about his feet. But if you look closely at David's right foot, the second toe extends noticeably past the big toe. This was not an accident. Michelangelo was trained in classical Greek proportion, and Greek sculptors had been carving that exact foot shape into their gods and goddesses for almost 2,000 years before he ever touched a chisel. 380 years later, in 1886, when the Statue of Liberty was unveiled in New York Harbor, French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi built her using the same classical proportional system. Her second toe extends past her big toe too. The most famous statue in the United States has a foot shape that, according to podiatric research, only shows up in roughly a fifth to a third of the human population. 2 of history's most iconic sculptures, separated by nearly 4 centuries and an ocean, both carry the same unusual anatomical detail. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns like that almost always have a story hiding underneath them. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The trait you are looking at on your own foot right now was not officially studied and named by medicine until 1927, when American orthopedic surgeon Dudley Joy Morton published his research describing a shortened first metatarsal bone as a distinct anatomical variant. Before Morton put a name to it, doctors had no formal framework for understanding why some feet loaded weight differently than others, why some people developed calluses in strange places, why some runners got stress fractures that others never did. For thousands of years, humanity had been sculpting this exact foot into marble as the symbol of physical perfection, without having the faintest idea what was actually happening inside the bone. The Greeks worshipped it as the mark of the divine. Modern medicine spent a century treating it as a disorder that could cause pain, instability, and injury. Both of those things are true at the same time, and figuring out how is going to take us somewhere much older than Greece, older than sculpture, older than the idea of beauty itself. Let's start with what you are actually looking at, because the name longer second toe is slightly misleading. Your toes are just the visible tips. The real structural story is happening deeper inside your foot, in a set of 5 long bones called the metatarsals, which connect your ankle to your toes and form the main framework of your forefoot. The first metatarsal sits behind your big toe. In most people, it is the longest and thickest of the 5 because it needs to be. It is the primary weight-bearing structure of the human foot. In a smaller portion of the population, that first metatarsal bone is shorter than usual, sometimes because its growth plate closes earlier during childhood development than the growth plate of the second metatarsal. When that happens, the big toe effectively sits further back than it would otherwise, which makes the second toe appear to stretch past it. Your toe did not grow too long. A bone deep inside your foot simply stopped growing sooner than its neighbor. That single structural difference is what podiatrists now formally call Morton's toe, or in clinical terminology, Morton's foot syndrome, or relative second metatarsal elongation. It is not a disease. It is a variation, one of several recognized forefoot patterns that show up consistently across every population on the planet. Before we get to the categories themselves, it helps to understand why a foot shape would even be worth naming in the first place. Your feet do more physical work over your lifetime than almost any other part of your skeleton. The average person takes somewhere in the range of several thousand steps a day, which adds up to millions of steps over a single year, and, across a lifetime, a number of steps large enough to circle the earth multiple times over. Every one of those steps sends force through the same 26 bones, 33 joints, and roughly 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments packed into each foot. Small structural differences that seem trivial when you're standing still become significant when they're repeated millions of times under load. That is exactly why podiatrists and anatomists became interested in categorizing forefoot shapes in the first place. Not out of curiosity about appearance, but because the shape of your forefoot quietly determines how forces travel through your body with every single stride you take for your entire life. Podiatric literature groups human forefeet into a handful of recurring shapes, and these categories were given names by 19th and early 20th century anatomists who noticed how frequently they matched depictions in classical art. The most common configuration worldwide, found in a clear majority of people, is often called the Egyptian foot. In this pattern, The big toe is the longest digit, and each toe after it tapers down in a smooth diagonal line, shortest at the pinky. It gets its name because Egyptian tomb paintings and statuary consistently depicted feet this way, and skeletal analysis of remains from the Nile Valley has shown the pattern was indeed common there, though it is common essentially everywhere. The second major pattern is the one we've been talking about, sometimes labeled the Greek foot, where the second toe is the longest digit on the foot. Estimates for how common this is vary depending on the study and the population sampled, but figures in the range of roughly 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 people show up repeatedly in podiatric surveys. A third and much rarer pattern, sometimes called the square or Roman foot, has the first 3 toes landing at almost exactly the same length, creating a flat, squared-off edge across the front of the foot. Estimates place this around 1 in 10 people or fewer. A few other regional labels, like Celtic foot or Germanic foot, get used informally to describe wider or more irregular combinations. But these are not standardized medical categories. They are folk descriptions that vary depending on which source you're reading. Here is where it gets genuinely important to slow down and be precise, because a lot of viral content about this topic overstates what science actually knows. You may have seen claims online about this trait being controlled by hundreds of specific genetic markers mapped by consumer DNA companies, the same way ancestry testing services report on eye color or earwax type. That specific claim does not hold up against the actual published science. What legitimate research does show is that relative toe length runs in families, and studies of twins and family lineages have found meaningful heritability, meaning genetics clearly plays a real role in whether your first or second metatarsal ends up longer. But unlike a trait such as eye color, which is influenced by a well-documented handful of genes, or height, which large genome-wide association studies have linked to many thousands of small-effect genetic variants scattered across the genome, the specific genetic architecture behind metatarsal length has not been mapped with anywhere near that level of precision or public documentation. It is almost certainly polygenic, meaning multiple genes contribute small effects rather than one single gene flipping a switch, and it likely interacts with developmental factors in the womb and early childhood, not just inherited DNA alone. So the honest answer is this: your toe shape is substantially inherited. It runs in families, but nobody has produced a rigorously peer-reviewed map of exactly which genes control it the way that exists for traits like height or blood type. Anyone who tells you they can spit in a tube and get an exact genetic breakdown of your toe architecture is simplifying, at best, and inventing numbers at worst. What we can say with much more confidence is why this variation might exist at all, and that story takes us all the way back to one of the most important transitions in the entire history of life on Earth, the moment our ancestors stood up. Humans are the only primates that walk fully upright as our default, everyday mode of movement. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, can walk on 2 legs for short bursts, but their feet are built for an entirely different job. A chimpanzee's foot functions almost like a second hand. The big toe is semi-opposable, meaning it can angle outward to grip branches and stabilize the animal while climbing. The whole structure is flexible and mobile, optimized for grasping surfaces, not for pushing off a flat ground surface with maximum force. Somewhere between roughly 4 and 6 million years ago, in the fossil record of early hominins, that architecture began to change dramatically. The big toe gradually lost its ability to splay outward and became locked in line with the other toes. The arch of the foot developed into something closer to a spring, storing and releasing energy with every step. The entire foot reorganized itself around a single evolutionary priority: walking and running efficiently across open ground for long distances, which is exactly the kind of movement early humans needed as they moved out across the African landscape and eventually the rest of the planet. Fossil evidence for this transition is scattered across some of the most significant discoveries in paleoanthropology. The famous Laetoli footprints, preserved in volcanic ash in modern-day Tanzania and dated to roughly 6 million years ago, show a walking gait already remarkably similar to a modern human stride, with weight moving from heel to toe in a pattern that would be immediately recognizable today. Skeletal remains, like the famous Lucy specimen, an early hominin dated to roughly 2 million years ago, show a mix of ape-like and human-like features in the pelvis and legs, a kind of anatomical snapshot caught mid-transition between a climbing body plan and a walking one. The foot did not change overnight. It changed gradually, over hundreds of thousands of generations, as the pressures of life on the ground increasingly rewarded bodies that could walk and run efficiently across open terrain rather than bodies built primarily for moving through trees. Inside that reorganized foot, the first metatarsal took on an enormous responsibility. During a normal walking stride, when your foot pushes off the ground to propel your body forward, a very large share of your total body weight, often cited in biomechanical studies as somewhere in the range of 40 to 60%, passes directly through the first metatarsal and big toe in that final push-off phase. That is not a minor detail. The big toe is essentially the launch pad of human locomotion, the final point of contact, and the primary source of forward propulsion in every single step you take. So what happens when that launch pad is built slightly differently, when the first metatarsal is shorter than usual and the second one effectively takes on more prominence? Biomechanically, the weight-bearing pattern shifts. Instead of loading cleanly and primarily through the big toe, more pressure transfers over to the second metatarsal head, the part of the ball of your foot sitting just behind your second toe. This altered loading pattern changes the mechanics of your entire gait cycle, the repeating sequence of movements your foot goes through with every step. Clinically, this has real consequences. People with a pronounced Morton's toe pattern are documented in podiatric and sports medicine literature to have a higher tendency toward calluses forming under the second metatarsal head, a condition called metatarsalgia involving pain and inflammation in that region, and in some cases a heightened risk of stress fractures in the second metatarsal during high-impact activities like running. Runners, dancers, and athletes with this foot type are sometimes advised by podiatrists to use specific insoles or orthotics that redistribute pressure back toward the first metatarsal to reduce strain. Given all of that, you might expect a trait with documented injury risks to have been slowly eliminated by evolution over tens of thousands of years, the same way harmful mutations tend to get filtered out of a population generation after generation once they consistently reduce survival or reproduction. That is exactly the kind of pattern natural selection tends to filter out over enough generations. And yet, Morton's toe has persisted at meaningful frequency across essentially every human population on Earth for as long as we've been able to study skeletal remains. That persistence is genuinely puzzling. And it's the reason some researchers have proposed that the trait might not be a pure disadvantage after all, but instead carries some kind of situational benefit that offsets the injury risk, at least in certain environments. One hypothesis that keeps surfacing in podiatric and evolutionary anatomy discussions involves terrain. A foot with a more prominent second metatarsal spreads load across a slightly wider portion of the forefoot during lateral and rotational movements, the kind of side-to-side stabilizing motion your foot makes constantly when you're walking on an uneven surface rather than a flat, predictable one. On rocky ground, steep slopes, forest floors littered with roots and stones, that wider distribution could plausibly offer better balance and stability than a foot structure built almost entirely around a single dominant load-bearing toe. Populations that lived for many generations in mountainous or rugged terrain, hill country in parts of West Africa, the uneven landscape of mainland Greece itself, hilly regions of Central Europe, may have experienced a subtle selective pressure favoring foot architecture that prioritized stability over pure straight-line efficiency. This remains a hypothesis rather than a proven fact. Researchers are still debating it, but it offers a compelling explanation for why a trait with documented downsides on flat, modern surfaces might have persisted for so long in the deep evolutionary past, when almost nobody walked on flat surfaces at all. Population data adds another layer to this story, and it directly undercuts the idea that this trait belongs to any single ethnicity or ancestry group. Surveys conducted across different populations have found the trait showing up at varying frequencies almost everywhere researchers have looked. Some studies of West African populations, including research involving the Idoma people of Nigeria, have reported prevalence rates in the upper 30% range, noticeably higher than the roughly 20 to 25% range commonly cited in European-descended populations, while East Asian populations in several surveys have shown comparatively lower rates. These are not rigid, absolute boundaries between groups, and results vary meaningfully depending on the specific study, sample size, and how researchers defined and measured the trait. But the broader takeaway is consistent. This pattern shows up in every population on Earth that has been studied at different frequencies, which tells us it is an old, deeply rooted piece of human variation rather than something tied to any one culture or bloodline. This brings us back to the Greeks and to why they get credit for something that, biologically, has nothing to do with being Greek at all. In ancient Greek sculpture, starting from at least the 5th century BCE and continuing for hundreds of years afterward, this exact foot pattern shows up again and again across the most celebrated works of the classical period. It appears on the Venus de Milo. It appears on the caryatids supporting the porch of the Erechtheion on the Acropolis. It appears across countless depictions of gods, goddesses, athletes, and warriors carved by sculptors trained in a rigid, proportional system that treated certain body ratios as mathematically ideal. To the Greeks, this was not an anatomical quirk. It was divine geometry, physical evidence of perfection, deliberately built into the bodies of their deities, because their aesthetic philosophy held that true beauty followed precise, repeatable proportional rules. When Rome absorbed Greek culture, Roman sculptors inherited the same proportional conventions and carried the pattern forward in their own statuary. When the Renaissance rediscovered and idealized classical antiquity in the 14th and 15th centuries, artists like Michelangelo studied ancient Greek and Roman sculpture directly and reproduced those same proportional systems in works like David. Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, painted in the 1480s, follows the same classical convention. And nearly 400 years after that, Bartholdi built the same proportional logic into Lady Liberty. For roughly 2,500 years, from Athens to Rome to Florence to New York Harbor, this exact foot pattern was carved and painted into some of the most important artworks humanity has ever produced. Not because the artists themselves had this trait, but because a cultural tradition treated it as the visual signature of perfection. That raises the real question underneath all of this. Why did a culture separated from us by 2,500 years land on this exact foot shape as its symbol of physical perfection, when we now know it appears in only a minority of people and carries genuine documented injury risks? Part of the answer may simply be aesthetic convention feeding on itself. Later, Greek sculptors imitating earlier ones until the pattern calcified into an unquestioned artistic standard, regardless of its biological accuracy or rarity. But it's also worth remembering that ancient Greek athletic and artistic culture were deeply intertwined. Sculptors studied real athletes, wrestlers, and runners as models, and it's entirely possible that a foot pattern offering genuine stability, advantages during dynamic, multidirectional athletic movement, wrestling, javelin throwing, distance running on rugged Mediterranean terrain, simply looked more athletic and dynamic to the people carving these statues, even if they never articulated why in biomechanical terms. Whatever the exact reason, one thing is clear and worth repeating plainly. Having what podiatrists sometimes casually call a Greek foot does not mean you have any actual Greek ancestry, in the same way that having what gets called an Egyptian foot does not connect you to the pharaohs. And having a squared Roman foot does not mean your bloodline marched with a legion. These are cultural labels borrowed from art history and applied retroactively to a piece of ordinary human skeletal variation that has existed across every population on the planet since long before Greece, Rome, or Egypt existed as civilizations at all. The names describe artistic conventions. They do not describe ancestry, ethnicity, or lineage in any scientifically meaningful sense. So what should you actually take away from looking down at your own foot right now? If your second toe extends past your big toe, you are carrying a structural variation in your first metatarsal that shows up in a meaningful minority of people across every population that has ever been studied, one that is substantially heritable, tends to run in families, and has been linked in biomechanical research to both a slightly higher risk of certain forefoot injuries and a possible stability advantage on uneven terrain, a trade-off researchers are still working to fully understand. It has nothing to do with intelligence, leadership, personality, or destiny, whatever folk traditions across different cultures may have claimed about it over the centuries. It is simply one of several recurring ways the human foot can be built, the product of a growth plate that closed at a slightly different time than its neighbor during your development before you were even born. If your big toe is clearly the longest digit on your foot, you carry the most statistically common forefoot pattern in the species, the one that places maximum load-bearing efficiency directly through your primary toe during every step, the pattern depicted consistently in ancient Egyptian art, and confirmed by skeletal analysis to have been common in the Nile Valley, though it dominates globally today regardless of ancestry. And if your first 3 toes land at close to the same length, you carry the least common of the 3 major patterns, a squared forefoot that distributes load more evenly across a wider platform, a variation that remains comparatively understudied in the research literature. It's also worth pointing out how much modern footwear has quietly changed the stakes of this old anatomical variation. For most of human history, feet developed and operated barefoot or in minimal coverings, meaning whatever structural pattern you were born with interacted directly with the ground, sand, dirt, rock, whatever terrain your ancestors actually lived on. Modern shoes, especially narrow, rigid, mass-produced shoes designed around an idealized average foot shape, don't always accommodate these natural variations well. Someone with a pronounced Morton's toe pattern wearing a shoe built for the far more common Egyptian foot pattern may end up with pressure concentrated in exactly the wrong place along the ball of the foot, which is part of why podiatrists sometimes recommend wider toe boxes, metatarsal pads, or custom orthotic insoles specifically for people carrying this trait. In other words, a foot shape that may have offered a genuine stability advantage on the uneven, natural terrain our ancestors actually walked on for millions of years can become a source of friction and discomfort inside a shoe designed in a factory a few hundred years ago. The trait itself hasn't changed. The environment around it has, which is a useful reminder that a lot of what we casually call a problem with the human body is really just a mismatch between an old, well-tested design and a very new, artificial environment it was never built to interact with, whether that environment is a factory-made shoe, a paved sidewalk, or a treadmill instead of open, uneven ground. None of these three patterns are defects. None of them are unambiguous advantages either. The proportions carved into David's foot in 1504 and into Liberty's foot in 1886 are not evidence of Greek genetics traveling improbably across centuries and oceans. They are evidence of an artistic tradition borrowing a piece of ordinary human anatomical variation and turning it into a symbol, one that happened to persist in Western art for 2,500 years simply because each generation of sculptors kept studying and imitating the ones before it. The next time you take off your shoes, actually look. Notice which toe reaches the farthest. Notice the shape your own feet have carried since before you could walk, inherited from parents and grandparents, and a long, largely undocumented chain of ancestors stretching back further than anyone in your family has ever mapped. It is not a message written specifically for you, and it is not a secret code revealing where your bloodline originated. It is simply one small, ordinary, genuinely fascinating piece of the much larger story of how the human body was built for walking, written not in ink or stone, but in the bones of your own feet, and carried quietly beneath you every single day, whether you ever noticed it or not. If this changed how you think about something as ordinary as your own feet, that's the whole point. The most interesting facts about the human body are usually hiding in the parts of it we never bother to look at closely. Drop a comment and tell us which pattern you found when you checked longer second toe, longest big toe, or that squared off first three toes, and share this with someone who has absolutely no idea their feet have a name borrowed from ancient sculpture.